Assalamu alaykum. Welcome to the Guess the Prophet quiz. 80 quick questions with 3 choices each. You'll have about 7 seconds per question. Think fast, keep it fun, and say your answers out loud. Ready? Bismillah. Which prophet was the first human created? Adam alayhi salam. Which prophet built a great ark by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command? Nuh alayhi salam. Which prophet was thrown into a fire yet stayed safe by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet was swallowed by a big fish and then saved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Yunus alayhi salam. Which prophet spoke in the cradle by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission? Isa alayhi salam. Which prophet split the sea by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet showed beautiful patience during a long illness? Ayub alayhi salam. Which prophet ruled a strong kingdom and understood birds by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will? Sulaiman alayhi salam. Which prophet had iron softened for him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission? Dawood alayhi salam. Which prophet saw a dream of stars, sun, and moon bowing to him? Yusuf alayhi salam. Which prophet is the final messenger to all people? Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Which prophet raised the foundations of the Kaaba with his son by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet told his people to stop approaching men with desire, then they were destroyed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Lut alayhi salam. Which prophet warned his people who carved homes in mountains and denied a clear sign? Salih alayhi salam. Which prophet was sent to the people of Ad? Hud alayhi salam. Which prophet showed strong trust when nearly sacrificed? Ismail alayhi salam. Which prophet was given the Zabur? Dawood alayhi salam. Which prophet's people were punished by the day of the canopy after denying him? Shu'aib alayhi salam. Which prophet was known for interpreting dreams? Yusuf alayhi salam. Which prophet's staff turned into a snake by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet asked for his brother to help him in the message? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet said, "My Lord, indeed I am overpowered, so help"? Nuh alayhi salam. Which prophet prayed for a child and was blessed with Yahya alayhi salam? Zakaria alayhi salam. Which prophet was raised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will and not killed by his enemies? Isa alayhi salam. Which prophet had the jinn subjected to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission? Sulaiman alayhi salam. Which prophet's family story includes Hajar radiallahu anha running between Safa and Marwa? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet showed clear signs before Pharaoh by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet was the father of Yusuf alayhi salam? Yaqub alayhi salam. Which prophet was praised as truthful and raised to a high station? Idris alayhi salam. Which prophet was the father of Yaqub alayhi salam? Ishaq alayhi salam. Which prophet was created without a father or mother? Adam alayhi salam. prophet will return near the end times by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will? Isa alayhi salam. Which prophet is called Khalilullah, the close friend of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet was given the Torah? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet was told to speak gently to a harsh ruler? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet's father made idols for the people? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet's people were the Thamud who denied a clear sign? Salih alayhi salam. Which prophet asked to see how the dead are brought to life and was shown birds? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet's mother placed him in a basket on a river by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet struck a rock and 12 springs flowed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet healed the blind by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission? Isa alayhi salam. Which prophet asked to be put in charge of the land's storehouses to manage supplies? Yusuf alayhi salam. Which prophet asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive his father but then stopped when told not to? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet advised his sons to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone at his death? Yaqub alayhi salam. Which prophet was tested when his sons took one of them and threw him into a well? Yaqub alayhi salam. Which prophet had the wind subjected to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command? Sulaiman alayhi salam. Which prophet warned a people who cheated in weights and measures? Shu'aib alayhi salam. Which prophet spoke to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Mount Sinai? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet broke the idols of his people to show their falsehood? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet was given knowledge of animal speech by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will? Sulaiman alayhi salam. Which prophet was taught how to make coats of armor by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Dawood alayhi salam. Which prophet's mother was told, "Do not grieve," when he was placed on water? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet brought the dead to life by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission? Isa alayhi salam. Which prophet faced a tyrant king and argued with wisdom? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet had a son who refused to board the ark? Noah alayhi salam. Which prophet had many prophets among his descendants by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grace? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet was made a prophet after his brother to support him? Harun alayhi salam. Which prophet's wife was among those who stayed behind when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed their city? Lut alayhi salam. Which prophet invited his people to reject Baal and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone? Ilyas alayhi salam. Which prophet fashioned a bird from clay that came to life by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission? Isa alayhi salam. Which prophet was told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take off his sandals in the sacred valley of Tuwa? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet thanked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for granting him children in old age? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet said, "My Lord caused me to land at a blessed landing place"? Noah alayhi salam. Which prophet received good news of a forbearing boy? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet received the sign of a white shining hand by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet called his people day and night for 950 years? Nuh alayhi salam. Which prophet was given the Injil? Isa alayhi salam. Which prophet was granted a pure line including Ishaq alayhi salam and Yaqub alayhi salam? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet was unable to speak to people for 3 nights except by signs? Zakaria alayhi salam. Which prophet was taught wise judgment and given firm speech? Dawood alayhi salam. Which prophet was sent to a people destroyed by a violent wind? Hud alayhi salam. Which prophet had 12 sons, including Yusuf alayhi salam? Yaqub alayhi salam. Which prophet was born without a father by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command? Isa alayhi salam. Which prophet said to Pharaoh, "Send with us the children of Israel"? Musa alayhi salam. Which prophet was tested by being asked to sacrifice his son? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which prophet was called Ulul Azm along with others like Ibrahim alayhi salam and Musa alayhi salam? Nuh alayhi salam. Which prophet was sent as a mercy to the worlds? Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Which prophet's people once said, "Who is stronger than us in power?" Hud alayhi salam. Which prophet was sent with the sign of the she-camel? Salih alayhi salam. Which prophet was taught the names of all things by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Adam alayhi salam. Great job! If you enjoyed the Guess the Prophet challenge, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so your friends can play too. See you in the next quiz. Assalamu alaykum!